Okay, jet lag and science. I arrived in China after a 24-hour travel day, and I wanted to share some of the tips about my experience with jet lag this time because usually I struggle a lot with jet lag. It takes me about a week to feel normal after I do the China and US travel. But this time I feel like I've had like a much smoother experience, and so I wanted to explore a bit more about the science behind jet lag and if there's things that we can do to help mitigate some of the effects. Just for reference, there is a 12 to 13 hour time difference between the US and China, depending on if there's daylight savings or not going on in the US. But usually it is the complete opposite time. So when it's 6 a.m. in China, it's 6 p.m. in America, but right now because of daylight savings, it's 13 hours. But for the sake of this video, we'll just call it like complete opposite time zones. And this is like the most challenging type of jet lag to have because it is the exact opposite. So keep that in mind as we go through the video. If you also have an upcoming transcontinental flight or are going somewhere with a different time zone, hopefully some of these tips will help you. Let's start off with some information about what jet lag is and why we have it in the first place. So jet lag exists because we have what's called a circadian rhythm in our bodies. The circadian rhythm is a 24-hour internal body clock that matches the external world. So what that means is like when it's light outside, our bodies are used to being awake. And then when the sunlight goes down, when it's night outside, our bodies are used to being asleep. And so our bodies essentially match what is going on in the real world. Of course, now we have things like smartphones and like lamps that allow us to stay awake for hours beyond sunset, but that's probably not the best thing for our health. Like in an optimal state, we are rising when the sun rises and then going to sleep when the sun sets, or like, a couple hours or something like within that range, but that's like what our bodies prefer for like optimal health. And then the reason why we have jet lag is because there is this mismatch between our internal body clock and the external world. We were not meant to be traveling places that are like 12, 13 hours different than our internal body clock within the span of like a day, which is like what happens when you do a US to Asia trip, is like you switch time zones so dramatically and so quickly that your body doesn't have enough time to adjust, and so then you end up with jet lag. And we all know that jet lag consists of things like fatigue and like insomnia and just general grogginess. It's just very hard to operate normally when you have jet lag because your body is like so out of whack. Basically, you might feel tired when it's still light outside, and you might feel like it's hard to, or you might get up early in the middle of the night, for example, when you're meant to be sleeping. So jet lag is essentially this mismatch between what's going on in your internal body clock, your circadian rhythm, and what's actually going on in the real world. And again, this leads to like a bunch of those symptoms that I mentioned. One thing that's interesting to point out is that research shows that it's easier to travel westward than it is to travel eastward. So let's say you're in the US and you're traveling from New York to LA, that's traveling west, and the time zone moves back 3 hours. That trip is easier to adapt to in terms of jet lag than the LA to New York trip, which is eastward. And the thought behind this, according to research, is that we find it much easier to extend our day, which is what happens when you travel westward. You're like kind of adding hours to the day, so to speak. And that is easier for us to do, to stay awake, than it is to calm down and go to sleep earlier, as would be the case if you did the eastward travel. So for example, let's say that you are waiting for a phone call from a relative who lives in a different place and the time zone is different, so you have to stay up later, or you have like a work project that you have to do, so you have to stay up later. That type of extension of the day is easier for us to adapt to than it is if I were to tell you, for example, tonight you have to go to sleep at 6 p.m., that would be way harder for you than it would be to stay up for later, for example. So that's an interesting point that I think needs to be highlighted because it just shows the difference between eastward and westward travel and how that also impacts your jet lag. So understanding that, the research shows that when we travel westward, our circadian rhythm shifts about 90 minutes a day, an hour and a half. But when we travel eastward, it shifts about an hour a day. So what that means is like when you travel westward, it's much easier and much faster for you to adapt to that new time zone than it is when you travel eastward, because when you travel eastward, it's only about an hour a day that your body is shifting. And that's why I think like when I travel to China, it takes so long for me to adjust because of that eastward travel. But I'll kind of get into the uniqueness of the US to China travel because it is that like complete opposite. So like whether or not you even consider eastward or westward is kind of like in the eye of the observer, I guess. But just know that when you're traveling westward, expect that trip to be easier because of the jet lag. It's going to be easier for your body to adjust. When you travel eastward, it's going to be harder. So if you find that to be the case for you, just know that that's normal. Now I'm going to share a few of the things that I did this trip that I feel like made a big difference in terms of my jet lag. I'm about a week into the trip and I feel more or less normal. And these were the things that I did that made a difference. The biggest thing out of jet lag research seems to be the exposure to sunlight. This is what researchers highlight as probably one of the most important things that matters when you're trying to shift your jet lag is when you're getting exposure to sunlight, basically. So this time when I traveled, I left the US at night and arrived in the morning China time. So that is already different than what I usually do because usually I'm leaving in the morning US time, arriving at night China time, and then I try and go to sleep and then I just wake up in the middle of the night. And so it leads to this snowball effect where like every day maybe I'll wake up an hour later, like I mentioned with that shift of eastward travel, it's like about an hour a day. I've experienced that, but it just leads to like a long time of like trying to adapt.
Like, I'll wake up at like 2 a.m., then 3 a.m., then 4, and like gradually it shifts into like a normal wake time, but it takes a while.
This time I landed in the morning China time, and immediately after checking into the hotel and everything, probably like 8 a.m. or so, we went and ate a meal, we walked around outside, we sat in the sun for a while. And what the research shows is when you have a very large time zone shift, as is the case between the US and China, it's very important to try to get daylight in the morning. What the daylight does is it sends signals to your brain to be like, hey, this is daylight right now and you need to stay awake right now. I'll put a picture of a chart from a study right here that shows that when you're traveling eastward, which is the case from like East Coast US to China, you can actually treat that as westward travel because it is greater than 10 hours in time zone difference. So I'll put a picture of that chart here, and you can use this to help adjust when you should be getting daylight depending on the time zone difference between your departure city and then your arrival city. I thought that this was really helpful. So why sunlight is very important, especially when it comes to jet lag, is because your body is already thrown out of whack because it's your internal system is so used to the time from your departure city, and light serves as a great cue for how your body should be responding based on the city that you're in now. And usually sunlight is a great cue anyway for waking up your body in the morning, but even more so when it comes to jet lag, it's like the most important cue basically, according to the research. Okay, so we talked a bit about how getting sunlight in the morning when you arrive is very helpful for setting your circadian rhythm, but what about the light that gets emitted from like your phone, your laptop, the lamps, things like that? Like how does that come into play? So the research shows that just like when you're living your everyday life, if you're viewing a lot of light, you know, whether it's through electronics or something else, after the sun sets, that's going to have negative impacts on your sleep. And especially when you're going through jet lag and your circadian rhythm is already very vulnerable and out of whack, like basically your body cannot operate normally because it's sunny outside, but you feel tired. So there's this like huge mismatch. And on top of that, if you add in additional bright lights like from your laptop, after the sun sets, this can further throw your body out of whack because it's already confused. And then on top of that, it's dark outside, but you keep using these things with a lot of light. That's going to throw your body off a lot more. So what I did was I really did try to minimize the technology use after the sunset, especially in the first few days, again, when you're most vulnerable, because like that's when you're still very much still on your time zone of the departure city. I tried to minimize technology use in those days after sunset, especially just so that my brain wouldn't think that it's like, you know, daylight and I need to be alert. I really tried to wind it down and maybe like read a book or something, just do something non-tech or a non-screen so that my body has a chance to know that like, okay, it's nighttime and I can start like sleeping basically. So there's obviously a lot of focus on light because, as I mentioned, based on the jet lag research, it seems to be the most prominent component of overcoming jet lag is like the light exposure. So what light also does is it helps regulate your melatonin production, and that is the hormone that is triggered to help you fall asleep. So like melatonin rises and that makes you sleepy. If you're using screens and seeing a lot of light at night, that might disrupt your melatonin production, which then again might impact how well you can sleep. And again, especially when you're jet lagged in those first few days of arrival, your system is already so messed up. So like it's really important to be more sensitive and aware of how you're using your devices and then when you're getting that light in. Okay, the next thing that I did on the first day that I arrived was that I did not take a very long nap. And I'm very proud of myself for this because I set a timer for 30 minutes and actually I did wake up at the end of the 30 minutes. I didn't nap for like 4 hours. And this is obviously helpful for just helping yourself be able to fall asleep at a regular time that night. Because if you imagine, let's say like you take a nap starting at 2 p.m. and you don't wake up until 6 p.m., it's going to be really hard for you to fall asleep again at like 9 p.m., 10 p.m., 11 p.m., a regular bedtime because you've already napped for like half of the day. So if you are arriving on that first day and feeling tired, try taking a really small nap. But like if you feel like you're not going to be able to wake up, then it might be better to just supplement with some caffeine or something, just a little bit, so that you can get over that afternoon hump and then know that when you get over that, there's not too many hours before your bedtime. And this is something that I'm very proud of myself for doing because I usually don't do this, but I did get in a workout the first day that I landed, which is like, because I usually do not do that. I'm so wiped out from the traveling that I do not have it in me to like go to the gym. But luckily there is a gym at this hotel, which is super convenient. And basically the impact of exercise is not, I didn't see as much like, you know, data on that as light. Again, like I mentioned, light is like the big thing that everyone is obsessed about with jet lag. But just in general, exercise does have an impact on your cortisol levels. And cortisol is known as the stress hormone. Cortisol rising is what causes you to wake up, actually. So even though people think about having high cortisol as a bad thing, it's not necessarily the case all the time. Actually, cortisol does hit a peak and then it goes down. Like it hits its peak like when you wake up and then it kind of like declines throughout the day. So having high cortisol is not always a bad thing. But the thing with exercise, especially in the morning, is that even though exercise typically will also like spike your cortisol, it can help regulate it more. So where people run into issues with cortisol is like if you have chronically elevated cortisol, then that is bad because that means you're chronically stressed out. It's not natural to have high cortisol for a moment in time, but then it's meant to go down. So the benefit of exercise is that it can help modulate cortisol. So when you exercise, it does spike the cortisol, but it also helps it bring it down, basically. And that's like the trend line that you want to see is like this peak and then it, you know, goes down. You don't want it to stay high forever. So this time around, I did get in a workout that first day, and I do think that it helped with my alertness. Again, exercise can help modulate your cortisol levels. Cortisol is associated with your circadian rhythm. As I mentioned, the cortisol peaks like when that's how you wake up, is like the rise in cortisol. That's like a signal to your body like, hey, it's time to wake up. So it does have a relationship with your circadian rhythm, and that's also why I'm including it, is because I mean the research also shows this to an extent, is like the impact that exercise can have on jet lag. So what I found is that when I exercised that first day, I did it maybe in the early afternoon, which I think more ideal maybe is morning if you really want to time it correctly, because a lot of researchers also recommend morning exercises because again, it helps like modulate that cortisol like graph. But I did it in the early afternoon and I still feel like there are benefits of it. And I also think that it's important to remember to not exercise too close to when you're trying to sleep, because you don't want to spike your cortisol before you sleep, because that's going to like put you in this stressed out state and you're trying to like wind down. So I wouldn't do it like too close to when you're trying to sleep, but I think like morning, early afternoon is probably fine. That's what I did this time. And I do feel like because I did a bit of running, I did a bit of weightlifting, and that kind of wore my body down a little bit. Maybe that spike in cortisol was what I needed to feel like it could dip. And then that helps you with going to sleep because like the cortisol is declining. So then you're not as like worked up. So then you can more easily fall asleep. And then subsequent days since then, I found that working out in the morning has been very helpful for maintaining my energy levels throughout the day. What I did in day 2, day 3 was that after I woke up, went to the gym, ran for maybe like 15 to 20 minutes, just like moderately, like a little bit faster than a jog, but nothing like super intense, enough to get my heart rate up and like sweat a little bit, but nothing too intense. And then some days I would like lift weights, but again, nothing intense, nothing that was like super strenuous. And I did feel like that helped also make me hungrier. And then for breakfast, there's like a breakfast buffet here that's really nice, so I'm like fueling up on some protein and like vegetables and like fruits and things like that. So I'm also getting that like nutrition in. But I do feel like that maybe it's type 2 cardio in the morning really help maintain my energy levels throughout the day, where for those days and most days since, like I don't have that huge mid-afternoon crash out that I would typically for sure have under normal circumstances. Like every other time I've traveled to China, by 3-4 p.m. I'm like dying. Like it's so hard for me to stay awake at those hours. It's like the hardest, because you can imagine it's kind of like pulling an all-nighter. It's like you stayed awake until like 3-4 a.m. and you're kind of like crashing out at that time. So this time was totally different, and I have to, I think, partially attribute it to the fact that I did do those morning workouts. And I even went on a walk one day, a brisk walk for 30 to 45 minutes or so. And I don't feel like that had the same impact that the running did. So I feel like there's something maybe about getting the heart rate up, sweating a little bit, that does have an impact also on the energy that you feel throughout the day. Like my hypothesis is that I did not spike my cortisol enough that day that I went on the brisk walk, because when I'm walking, obviously my heart rate is closer to the resting heart rate than it is when I'm running. So maybe I didn't spike my cortisol enough, so then it's not modulated as well as it would be if I went on the run. I don't know, just a theory. But in conclusion, for this part, exercise does also play a role in jet lag, and usually it's recommended, at least in my case of like US to China travel, to do it in the morning. I think that idea also applies beyond jet lag. It's just like in general, there's a reason why morning workouts are recommended, is because it can help modulate your cortisol levels, which are important for alertness and also being able to fall asleep well at night. So we definitely covered a lot of stuff in this video. Hopefully you found some pieces of it useful. I know that I stuck with mostly like my personal experience this time of like US to China travel, but that is kind of the most dramatic time jet lag that you can have, and like time zone difference. Actually, isn't the time zone difference? I think it's just like that's the most dramatic jet lag you can have because it's like the complete opposite. So I thought it would be an interesting example to use for jet lag. But like in this one paper, the author does have a good rule of thumb, and he just writes like a simple recommendation for travel across up to 8 time zones is to seek exposure to bright light in the morning after eastward travel and in the evening after westward travel. So this is like a more moderate type of travel where like 8 time zones would be like for sure like New York to LA, or it would be in some cases it would be like New York to Paris would also I think be included in that, but just like a less dramatic time zone difference up to 8 time zones. And so seek bright light in the morning after eastward travel because you are trying to basically like move your clock back into the morning. Because for example, like New York to Paris is 6 hours ahead usually of New York. So then it's like daylight when it's still nighttime in America. So you're trying to like move your clock back to when it's daylight. So that's why when you're traveling eastward, it's helpful to get that light in the morning because you're trying to move your clock back to the daylight hours essentially. And then when you travel westward, which like I mentioned would be a New York to LA trip, you're trying to extend your day. And then that's why getting the sunlight in the evening is actually helpful because it's training your body to stay awake for longer. So you're like pushing your clock further out basically. And there's like fancier terms for this that I researched called like phase advancement and like phase delay. But I think for the purposes of this video, it's just like helpful to know that general rule of thumb is like if you're doing kind of less heavy duty travel, which is like, again, within that 8 time zones, if you're traveling eastward, get that daylight in the morning. And then when you're traveling westward, try to seek light at night so that you can extend your day. That's just like a general good rule of thumb, I think, to have. Again, I hope that this video was helpful for you, and I think honestly one of the most important things is just to not freak out when you arrive in your new city because again, it's gonna take your body time to adjust, and rightfully so because you're like jerked it completely in this like new place and it's like freaking out internally. So if it takes your body time to adjust, it's totally natural. And honestly would make sense because we're not like robots that can just like turn on and off. We do have a circadian rhythm that we must adhere to that is very much tied to the natural daylight and nighttime hours. So again, be gentle with yourself. Make sure to subscribe and give this video a like if you liked it, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.